Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Yes. Welcome to the Downtown Bend Library. My name is Liz Goodrich, and I am the coordinator, or supervisor now, got a promotion, supervisor for adult programs. And you are here for a program that's part of a Novel Idea 2023. So, Novel Idea is celebrating its 20th anniversary. 20 years ago, library staff asked the simple question, what would happen if everybody in Deschutes County read the same book? And 20 years later, we know that wonderful things happen when everybody reads the same book and engages with programs about the book, engages with each other around the book, and then, of course, engages with an author at the final event. So, in honor of this milestone, 20-year milestone, we decided to invite 4 authors from the past, Novel Idea projects, back to help us celebrate 20 years. So they're all going to be here on April 29th at Bend High. David James Duncan, who was our first Novel Idea author, Maria Amparo Escandon, who was our 3rd, Peter Heller was our 12th, and Anne Griffin was our first COVID author. She was set to come, and 2 weeks before we were going to entertain her, COVID arrived. So
is she coming from Ireland?
She is coming from Ireland, so we're super excited. But she and I are both like, yeah, we'll believe it when we see it, and let me know when the plane lands. Anyway, super happy that, this is the state's largest and most robust and successful reading project. Thanks to so many participants and sponsors who continue to donate funds to allow us to do this kind of programming and keep it free and open to the public. So tickets for the final author event are at the desk, or you can get them online, and we hope that you will join us. Okay, so that's the spiel about Novel Idea. I'd like to introduce you to 2 of my favorite people. This is Steve and Pete Goodrich. Last name may sound familiar. Start with Steve. He turned 18 in 1968 at the height of the Viet Nam War. Though not a Quaker, he began college at a Quaker school where he was involved in the peace movement. He was drafted after he left college in his junior year. After completing his alternative service, he returned to school and finished a degree at Boise State. He's retired after successive careers as a National Park Service ranger, an attorney, and a cement manufacturing manager. Steve and his wife Roxanne had 2 daughters, one of whom chose to serve in the Army, and young grandchildren, all who love to spend time outdoors as much as he does. And this is Pete. A chance encounter with a recruiting brochure from the Army Reserve Officer Training Corps led Pete, as a somewhat directionless high school graduate, into what became a 30-year career as a regular Army National Guard, and Army Reserve officer. In between military deployments for training and overseas wartime duty, he pursued careers as a museum exhibits manager, public school teacher, and alternative education school administrator. He settled down in Central Oregon in 1999 with his wife, me, and their 2 sons, Max and Owen.
Me.
He retired from military service in 2015 and will retire from public education later this year. So welcome, Pete and Steve. I'm going to start with some questions. They may take it and run with it, but I'm going to sort of kick the can to start with. So we invited these gentlemen here to talk because who's read the book? Okay, perfect.
Couple.
So the Brothers K, which is why we're here, is a book about a family of 4 brothers, 2 sisters, and their tumultuous time during the 60s. So Steve, just tell us a little bit about yourself in relationship to the Brothers K and what resonated with you after you read it.
Okay. First of all, as Liz has just said, there were 4 brothers central to the Brothers K. They're all about my age. The older 2 were born a year or 2 before I was, the 3rd in the same year I was born, and the 4th a couple of years later. So we're very much the same era. And in reading the book, and Pete and I have read the book, I find that the brothers, all four of them, in some respect, I connect with. I mean, our experiences are not identical, but there is a great deal of overlap. And the oldest brother, was very active in the anti-war movement during the Viet Nam War, ultimately went to Canada. The second brother actually went to school on the East Coast, Ivy League school, and became very interested in Eastern religions, ended up touring in India, which is a lot more than I would have pursued, but I did pursue a little bit of Buddhism at that time in my life. Third brother ended up dealing with the draft, ended up getting drafted into the Army and serving in Vietnam. So there's a linkage there. And the youngest brother, Cade, he's really the narrator of the book and an observer, documenting all of this, and I can identify with that as well. So for me, there's a lot of linkage to the book, and Pete and I are from a family of 5 children, so good-sized family as well. The distinction here is that while I'm out of that same era, came of age during the Vietnam War, Pete is 13 years younger than me, so we had more of an age spread in our family and different experiences as a consequence, which we'll talk about a little.
Great. Thanks. Pete, you want to respond to the question? After you describe a little bit about yourself in relationship to the Brothers K.
Sure. Well, I really got into the book when I first started reading it because actually Steve probably grew up playing a lot more baseball than I ever did. And I learned a lot about baseball reading the book. But I spent much of the book knowing that one of the brothers was ultimately going to end up in the military, ultimately end up in Vietnam. And I wanted to get to that part. I wanted to find out how that was going to be resolved. But everything along the way, all the family dynamics, not that they were that similar to our own. It was just a really entertaining read. And then I finally got to the part where Erwin, the third brother, goes to Vietnam and the consequences of that. So I related to the book mostly from that sense.
Thank you. Steve, tell us a little bit about the Goodrich family lineage and arrival in the United States, in America.
Yeah, just as background, we're from immigrant stock like virtually everyone else on this continent, and our earliest ancestor to arrive here arrived in 1635. The last one in 1866. They came from England and Wales, and the last family from Norway. So there's a lot of time depth there, and also a lot of service, which Pete is familiar with as well.
And you have a, remind me, you have a branch of the family that was Quaker?
Yes, yeah, that actually we only came across fairly recently, but my wife is a genealogist and took me back on a couple of lines in the family that I wasn't familiar with, and one of them is a Quaker branch, and found some interesting family history about some of the conflicts and concerns within that branch during the Civil War, where they were, on the one hand, very supportive of emancipation of slaves, but on the other hand, very conflicted about whether to serve in the Union Army.
So Pete, why don't you fill us in a little bit about the Goodrich military history?
Yeah, so from what we've been able to ascertain, mostly through Roxanne's research, but also through more recent family lores, I mean, we're talking veterans going back to the American War of Independence or the American Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, certainly the Civil War, which is well documented in our family, World War I, World War II, Korea. Our father served during World War II in the Army Air Corps as a B-17 bomber co-pilot based in England. And Steve is actually, his middle name honors our great uncle, our dad's uncle, who was a medic who died of wounds he sustained in Germany in 1945, just 2 months before the war in Europe ended. And then both of our uncles served in Korea during the Korean War. And then much more recently, I served in Afghanistan and also in Iraq. So pretty long line of folks involved in some form of national service.
Steve, any other service members you'd like to mention?
Well, I will.
Yeah, good.
And I don't remember if you already have, but one of our daughters, chose to serve in the military. She was primarily an intelligence analyst linguist with the U.S. Army, something that she chose to do after graduating from high school. So we have that history, and then I just wanted to mention my wife's family as well. I mean, they aren't obviously directly a part of our family, but they're typical of, I think, of subgroups within the country. Roxanne's father was military, career Air Force, and served in World War II with 4 of his 5 brothers. So all 5 of the brothers who were eligible to serve at the time served voluntarily in World War II. The youngest one died on Okinawa, and they happened to be Hispanic. They were from the state of New Mexico. Their lineage goes back to when New Mexico was part of Mexico, so they're actually people who were able to say, we didn't cross the border crossed us, but they are still, were then and are still considered by some a minority in this country. They were a Spanish-speaking family and Hispanic surname, but a lot of service there. So.
Thank you. So this is all just putting this forward conversation in context. So you've gotten to know the brothers Goodrich a little bit about the history of the family. And so Steve, you grew up in the 50s and 60s, and I just wonder if you can share any childhood memories that you had of your dad's service, and how did the military show up when you were a young person?
Right.
Before the coming of age, when you were a kid.
Yeah, that takes us back to the 50s. And at that time, Dad was still in the Air Force Reserve. It was, by then, the Air Force had become a separate branch. He was still doing a little flying. We, at that time, were living in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and in a neighborhood where almost all of my friends' fathers were also World War II veterans. It was unusual if a father wasn't a veteran for one reason or another, and they had served in different branches, different experiences. A couple of them had come home wounded, but it was an idyllic time as a child in the 50s, post-war. A great cohesive neighborhood. It was a cohesive neighborhood with the adults. It was cohesive with the kids. We roamed as an informal and almost entirely innocent gang of kids anywhere we wanted to go, and we were very much aware of our father's service, and in fact we spent a lot of time playing Army, but you know, just a very positive image of all of it at the time.
How about you? You remember how did the military show up for you as a young person?
Yeah, so I like to say that I was the part of the earliest G.I. Joe generation, that action figure, what my sisters just referred to as that doll. The G.I. Joe action figure came out about the time I was born. And yeah, my buddies and I played Army all the time. We were very into all of that. We still had remnants of our dad's uniform in the dress-up box, including some of his flight caps, one of which I still have. Thankfully, it was salvaged from being worn out by us kids. But yeah, very much brought up by Hasbro and other such companies to believe that fighting was cool and all that. But by the time I got to high school, I had no thought of going into the military at that point.
So you grew up both of you playing Army. Tell us about that coming of age for you, Steve, in the 60s, late 60s, going off to college, and how did that path reveal itself to you?
Yeah, that was a very formative time. I mean, anybody who was alive in the 60s and aware of what was going on, there was a great deal of change, quite a bit of it disruptive, but somewhere along the line in early high school, I think, I became very sensitized to what was going on in the civil rights movement. At that time, we had moved to Indiana, and there was more of a minority population where we were there than there had been in Minnesota. Our mother was sensitive to those issues, talked about it, expressed concerns. We had basically almost an activist youth minister in the church that my parents attended at the time. Anyway, that was kind of an entryway for me to begin to question what was going on around me. And at the same time, the U.S. presence in Viet Nam was growing. And in high school, I became involved with a group of young friends, including some Quakers, who were committed to doing what we could to begin to achieve some change in the area of equality and civil rights. And also it was an entry into the peace movement. So I became involved in those things in high school, and ultimately elected to go to a Quaker college. By the way, I know Pete had mentioned earlier, not here today, that his entry to the military was through a brochure that Mom had probably left on his desk, and he'll talk about that, or on the table. My entry into the Quaker school, I was already involved to some extent with Quakers. We were not Quakers. But my mother actually attended a presentation by the college I attended, Earlham College, which is in Indiana, and is a Quaker affiliated school. And she came back very enthusiastic about the school and thought this might be a good fit for me. I had visited a couple of other schools, and I visited Earlham, and I knew as soon as I was on the campus that it was a good fit for me. But of course, being a Quaker school, it was the peace movement there, and it was more peace movement than anti-war. But of course, if you're part of the peace movement, you are opposed to war, to violence, and so that was what I became immersed in my first couple of college years.
Pete, how about you? Your coming of age road. Tell us that story.
Yeah, so mine was much less dramatic or emotional and more economic. I graduated from high school in 1981. Cold War was still going on, but that was about it. Things were quiet. There was no draft. It was the all-volunteer military. I knew I was going to go off to college. I ended up as an alternate for an academic scholarship at the university I wanted to attend, the University of Wyoming. But one day this brochure shows up from the Army ROTC department at the University of Wyoming, and I didn't really look at it at first, because to me, when I was in high school, ROTC was, the junior ROTC program was where the kids went who didn't want to do regular PE. So I didn't have a real high opinion of ROTC, even though our dad was an ROTC cadet at one point in his life in college. Anyway, finally opened the brochure and saw that they offered scholarships to help pay for college. And you know where that's going. I got interested in perhaps being able to help pay for my schooling that way. And I got involved with the program at the University of Wyoming as a freshman, and kind of found my niche. All of a sudden, it just felt natural to me, and I stuck with it, and they helped pay for my college. And ultimately, 30 years later, they have been helping pay for Owen's college and Max's college.
Yeah, thank you. So, Steve, why don't you tell everybody about your arriving at the decision, or how you got to the alternative service decision? And maybe people need to know what that is. Yeah.
Well, and that's come up in a number of different contexts. I was attending a Quaker college. Quaker Society, Religious Society of Friends, is one of the original peace churches. They are pacifists generally, and particularly the Eastern groups. And there was a strong presence on the campus. I had a number of friends who were committed pacifists, and there was even counseling available in that type of setting for people like myself who weren't birthright Quakers, because what happens, the selective service had by then, for decades, had an alternative program, which is primarily for the people who were birthright members of the traditional peace churches, but potentially for others as well, to opt out of military service and perform alternative service that was considered to be in the national interest, generally in the areas of health and safety. And so that was something that was, information was widely available and commonly discussed where I was. Now, what I found out afterwards, I began my alternative service, or did my alternative service in Idaho once I was approved for it. And in Idaho, I started meeting guys my age who were Viet Nam veterans, or veterans who served elsewhere but had already served in the Army. And in conversation, when it came out that I had chosen an alternative and been granted status as a conscientious objector, most of them had no idea that that was even an option. I mean, they were generally, they graduated from high school in a place like Twin Falls, Idaho, and started a job and were drafted and went into the Army. It was just expected, that there was no consideration that there was any choice or any viable alternative. And so they were always interested. That's one thing I found that was of interest, is how much interest some of the veterans that I got to know over the years had, and what my experience was, and what it involved. But it's a program that was and still potentially is available through the selective service system. But of course, the draft hasn't been in effect since Viet Nam. But the idea is you must have the birthright folks are in. It just, boom, the government accepted that. If you were not birthright, you had to justify your religious or moral conviction for pacifism in order to qualify for alternative service. And that's a challenging process.
So, but you were at school, you were at college.
Yes.
Tell us about that, when the draft happened.
Yeah.
And that when going from school to alternative service, what timeline was that?
Yeah. The situation gelled for me during the first draft lottery, which was in 1969. I was a sophomore in college then. I watched the lottery on television with a group of my friends, some of them Quakers, most of us not. And for anyone that was coming of age then, the expectation was that the lottery involved putting all 365 days of the year in a drum and drawing them out one by one. And your birthday was assigned a number as it came up. Now the first 100 or so could expect to be drafted. That's just the way it worked. So I watched with friends, and of course we were all interested to see, well, mine came up 54, so I was going to be drafted at some point. Most of my friends were well over 100, and they no longer had to consider it at that point unless they chose to enlist, which I don't believe anyone that I knew did. I did have one friend who was drafted into the Army and went. But so it was clear to me that I was going to have to deal with the draft and confront it. And as Pete ran through, we have a long family history of service. And I happen to believe in national service. I think it should be universal. I think it should cover any range of possibilities, but I think part of the fragmentation that we experience today is that not enough people have been tapped to serve the greater good of our American community. But in any case, I had a sense of wanting to serve, but not in a military sense. So I went through the process of applying for conscientious objector status. I had support from the Quaker community. I actually had a counselor. I haven't mentioned this before, but my counselor was a birthright Quaker who served as a smoke jumper during World War II, because even in that war, which was considered a just war by many, if not most, Quakers did not serve in the military generally, and Al ended up as a smoke jumper in Montana. And that was back in the days when smoke jumping was nuts. I mean, the equipment was questionable, but he survived that, and he was actually my counselor in putting together my application, which involved letters of support, both family, teachers, and others, anyone that would vouch for the sincerity of the applicant. In that case, me.
So how did your folks, how did Jack and Mary respond to the news that you were going to be going down this route?
Mom was supportive. Mom wrote a letter of support. Dad was by and large silent, honestly. I mean, frankly, as I look back at that, he didn't understand me, and if I'm honest, I didn't understand him. And it was a strained relationship for a period of time with my father, but I'm happy to say that we got past that, reconciled, and had a great relationship for years. But no, he was a veteran. It was challenging for him.
Right. Pete, I can ask you, you were pretty young when this was. Do you have any recollection of dinner table conversation about Steve's?
No, yeah.
Pursuing alternative service?
I do have a mental picture in my head of scenes from the Viet Nam War playing on TV, like down in the den, the TV room. So I was old enough to be aware that there was a war on. But in the first place, we didn't really talk much at the supper table. That was just not something us upper Midwesterners did a lot of. And by then, Steve was out of the house. And yeah, we never came up really as a topic of conversation, which is partly why we're having this conversation now, because for, 30 years, Steve and I have lived far apart, haven't had many opportunities to compare notes. And it's only been in the last really 5 years or so that we've had more conversations about his choice and my choice and how those came about. And if it wasn't for this, there would have still been a lot of unasked questions, because we just, it's not how our family works. We don't get in each other's business a whole lot.
So Steve, why don't you tell us about the service that you did?
Yeah. Well, and I should have said before, but alternative service is a 2-year commitment. It was the same length of time as those who were drafted. I mean, volunteers served longer, but if you were drafted, you served 2 years. And I was drafted. I stopped out of school in part to deal with the draft. I was drafted. I was at that point in the process of applying for conscientious objector status. I didn't have it yet. In fact, my local draft board turned me down, and I ultimately had to go through an appeal process to the level of the state board before the state board did approve alternative service. Part of the deal with alternative service is that you must relocate. They want you to have an experience somewhat like someone going into the military. I mean, you aren't off to boot camp, but you're off to someplace else to work. And at that time, I wanted to come to Oregon. I wanted to come to Central Oregon. But I wasn't able to find something here right away. The expectation is once you're approved, you have a certain period of time, I don't remember what it is now, to find an approved job, a job with an approved entity. I started looking in this part of the country, and ultimately the first place that offered me a job was a hospital in Boise, Idaho. So that's where I went. And I started out there as a medical surgical floor orderly, just providing general support services to the nursing staff. I asked for and ultimately got a transfer to the emergency room. I wanted to work around emergency medicine, which was interesting. And at a certain point, I actually, and it was I looked back at it and I said, did I really do that? But I did. I was interested in working on a fire lookout. Roxanne and I had just got a fire lookout for the Forest Service. Roxanne and I had just gotten married, and applied to lookouts, got a job on one. And in that era, that was the early 70s, there were still quite a few lookouts up on the various high points on the forests. We were on the Boise National Forest. There were 15 active lookouts that year. So we moved to the lookout. I left the hospital without informing the draft board. I thought, well, I'll sort this out. It really was a form of going AWOL. Got up on the lookout, and of course the hospital was required to report that I was no longer working there. I hadn't finished my full 2 years at that point. The draft board sent me a letter, located my forwarding address, sent me a letter wanting to know what was going on. The letter came through the Forest Service district office. We were in the middle of a very hot fire season. We were doing a good job on the lookout. They were very happy to have us where we were. We were just circumstantially on a lookout that caught more fire reports that year than any other lookout on the forest. The district ranger himself brought the letter up to me with the selective service on it, and he said, "Are you being drafted?" And I said, "Well, actually, I have been drafted, and here's the situation." And I explained it to him, and he said, "Would it help if I write a letter? I certainly think what you're doing is in the national interest." And I said, "Yeah, I mean, anything will help. Otherwise, I'm going to have to pack up and get back on track." And he wrote a letter to the board about our work and the need for keeping us on the lookout, particularly with the experience base that we'd established in that first few months. And the board approved my status as a fire lookout. So I finished out doing, and it was seasonal work, but the fire lookout, I did firefighting. That actually was so busy during the seasons we were up that I would get pulled off the lookout by helicopter to fight fires, and Roxanne would be the full-time lookout. I'd be brought back to the lookout, and we'd share time, and then I'd get pulled again. When we came off the lookout in the fall, I did fire protection patrol down in the valleys during hunting season until we got snowed out of the mountains. So that's actually how I finished. I got in my full 24 months, and I got my status granted as having served 2 years of alternate service.
Thank you. Pete, you want to tell us about your service experience, your military experience?
What that looked for you.
I'm sorry?
Yeah. A lot longer.
Yeah, but a lot of it was kind of accidental. I did go into the ROTC program. I did earn my regular Army commission. I served 4 years during the kind of the tail end of the Cold War. You know, when the Soviet Union, the evil empire, was still our greatest threat, at least in our minds. And then I left active duty because I had gone in telling myself if I loved it, I'd keep doing it. If I just sort of liked it, I'd move on. And I just sort of liked it, so I moved on. But I'd like to say that the one piece of advice that our father gave us that I know I listened to was he encouraged me to stay in the military reserves when he knew I was going to leave active duty, because he had some regrets that he had not been able to keep his military reserve career going after he came back from World War II, because he started raising a family of 5 kids and started a new career, and he just couldn't keep that many flaming torches in the air. But he said, you really ought to consider staying in the reserves. So I kind of did. Gulf War happened. I volunteered to go back on active duty, but they didn't need my specialty. At that time, I was an anti-aircraft officer. And of course, in that war, the Iraqis didn't put any aircraft up. because they all would have been shot down by our Air Force rapidly. So, but that move, trying to get back in out of the so-called individual ready reserve, ultimately landed me in the Wyoming Army National Guard. I was with them for 6 years, had a great time. Because again, we weren't fighting anyone at the time. It was running around in the woods, shooting blanks and playing soldier on one weekend a month. And then we moved out here. I transferred into the Army Reserve, which is a little different, into a different specialty called Civil Affairs. And 9/11 happened, and then things got real. So 15 years into a 30-year career, when I just got married, just had a young child, and all of a sudden it's, hey, it's time to put up or shut up and go to war.
I was just listening to that story. I was not getting my next question ready because I was like, that's really interesting.
I can continue from there. I mean, it went fine. Did a tour in Afghanistan. We rotated back. I went to Iraq 5 years later with the exact same unit. We did our tour there, and we came back. Liz was left at home both times for about a year each time, raising Owen and Max. And I honestly believe she had the harder of the two tours of duty, because especially in Afghanistan, we felt we were there for the right reasons and doing the right things, especially in my specialty, which, you know, our job as civil affairs was to help with restoring peace and stability. We are the interface between the combat troops and the civil populace. So anyway.
So Steve, I'm wondering, watching your youngest sibling pursue a military career, did you have any feelings about that, or how did you feel about Pete's military service?
I respect Pete's military service, and I come at that from a couple of different angles, but I mean, one is even from a Quaker perspective, there is respect for and allowance for others to make their own choices. It's not exclusive, it's not judgmental, and at the same time, you know, as I've said before, at the time I performed or pursued and then performed my alternative service, there's no doubt that I was of course I was young, and I was very idealistic and quite naive, frankly. I was of the mind that perhaps we were about to change the world and put conflict behind us, that maybe the age of Aquarius was going to arrive, and it did not. So, you know, there was a lot of growing realistic perspective and an appreciation for what Pete was doing. And actually, you know, before Pete went overseas, our younger daughter was already in the military. She had chosen to serve, and she was actually at National Security Agency headquarters in Fort Meade, Maryland on 9/11. So that was very real to us at that point. But my views transformed over time, as many people's do. I realized when our older daughter was born that, well, I could potentially still view pacifism as something I could carry for myself. Seeing the small child, I said, you know, I can't impose it on this child. I will defend this child. And it changed my perspective on nonviolence, on military service, as as my experience and perspective evolved.
So Pete, as you got older and understood what your oldest brother, the choice he had made at that time, and knowing what you know now after these months of conversation that you guys have had, which has been delightful to listen to, how do you square your choice with your brother's choice?
Well, again, I think mine was easier. It was ultimately more selfish. I wanted the money. I'm being a little facetious, but yeah. Honestly, I mean, I'm glad I wasn't where he was, because I would not have had the courage to say no. I think I probably would have ended up in Viet Nam, not out of any sort of righteous belief in something, but because I didn't have enough belief in something. When I got to his age, I had the luxury of choice, an easier choice. And when I was deciding to go in, did I ever consider the fact that he had been a conscientious objector? It might have crossed my mind, but I wasn't trying to fill in some blank or cover some gap or anything like that. I just honestly was interested in paying for college. But once I got into it, I realized this is what I need to have some focus in my life, because I thought I knew what I wanted to do when I grew up, but when I went to college, but I didn't really. And getting involved in that program helped me find a focus. So I can remember having conversations with my military peers at different times and feeling like, ooh, I should really mention that my oldest brother, was a conscientious objector because of the context of the conversation we were having. But I think I usually did not mention it because I was afraid of some censure on the part of my peers who might not have really understood what I knew must have been an extremely difficult choice for him that I knew I respected.
Thank you. Really great stories and such interesting arcs for both of you. So now I just would like to open it up if people have questions to ask Pete or Steve about the topic. Any questions?
Steve, did you meet with disdain or prejudice from even your peer group when you were done, you went home, or you went home during your service?
No, not really. I found, well, first of all, when I was in working in the hospital, there were other conscientious objectors there. So I was not the only one. The others generally came from a more traditional background, but no, and as I said, I was surprised. I mean, I was a little cautious about approaching the subject, but I was surprised by the general reaction I got from the veterans of my age. Was curiosity. It was something they weren't familiar with. They heard about it. Okay, that was your experience, and they tell me about their experience, and I'm sure that here and there was probably someone that was critical of it, but I honestly don't remember a single instance of that. So.
Do you have any idea how many there were at that time, that 68 era?
Not really. There were a fair number. I think actually, it was 1971 when I began my alternative service, and coincidentally, for the people that have read the book, I began my alternative service the same month in which the Chance family took Win, the third son, home from the Army military, or the military mental institution. So there's a definite time connect there too. But by 1971, when I began alternative service, the war was winding down. It was beginning to wind down. There was some drawdown of troops, and I think that was a factor. The intensity wasn't the same as it was a few years earlier, and but you know, as I said, so many of these guys that are not that there were a lot, but there were some that I talked to who had served. I mean, they're literally my age. They came out of high school at the same time, 68. They were drafted within a year of graduating from high school, and about the time I met them, they'd come home from their 2-year military hitch. So, but yeah, and some of the conversations were more extended than others, but no harsh criticism. And you know, I would say too, which is not at all about me, but I know there was a lot, and still is, some negative publicity about the way, and understandably, the way that Vietnam veterans were treated on their return home. But that was not the Quaker way. I mean, Quakers would not say an unkind word to someone based on their service. They respect the differences. It's just a matter of choice. So there was none within my community of friends in college before I left. There was none of that criticism or bad behavior towards returning troops. It wouldn't have been done.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Well,
I think Kathy's ruminating.
I'm trying to think. Oh, go ahead. You got one already. Pete, you said something about your sons also benefited. Have they, like, are they in ROTC programs or?
No, but despite the fact that I got a scholarship through Army ROTC to pay for my college, normally that would have been the end of the educational benefits I would have been eligible for. However, because I had that second deployment, the one to Iraq, post 9/11, there was a bunch of legislation that basically made people like me eligible again for some parts of the GI Bill, the famous Montgomery GI Bill. So I had benefits that I could apply for. You had to be really careful and be aware of it and apply for them, but within a certain time frame of redeploying. But I did that, thankfully, and I got, what was it, 36 months worth of benefits that I could split between the two boys to pay for some tuition, to pay for housing. So that, I didn't expect that at all, but I certainly took advantage of it once I found out about it.
Yeah.
And it's, yeah, so it's been to our advantage that way.
Roxanne.
Steve, my understanding is, I mean, as a conscientious objector, you performed 2 years worth of service, but you didn't have follow-up benefits.
No, there are no benefits that come with that. It's not Department of Defense. It was all through the selective service system. So when you're
Were you paid by
paid by the employers.
the organization that took you on?
Yeah, I mean, the hospitals were appreciative of that program because they had employees who were working for really a very low wage to perform some essential services for them. So, I was paid at the hospital, and I was paid by the Forest Service as a seasonal employee. But there were no other benefits associated.
Thank you. Kathy, did you come up with something?
Well, yeah, I guess. So my dad did serve in Korean War, and then the year that he had gone married, and when I was conceived too, later that year, he was in Japan, serving in a hospital. He was a doctor. He had become a surgeon, and so he was an Army doctor. But they came back, unfortunately, in my opinion, came back in time to have me in Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indianapolis, and so I don't have dual citizenship. But anyway, my dad and I did not agree on a whole lot of stuff, and so I, growing up in the 60s and 70s, well, born in the 50s, but anyway, I was very much against the war in Vietnam and against wars in general. I could have been a good Quaker, I think, but whatever. Maybe I'll be one someday. And so my dad would speak with great disdain about me, calling me a peacenik. And here, to get to the question though, or to what I still don't understand is about how people can do it, can join an army and go kill people. What's that about? I don't understand war. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me. So I would have been the CO like Steve, right? It was. But you know, I don't want to be judgmental or critical or anything. I just want to understand, how can people do it?
Well, that's obviously a very deep question, and one that would be difficult to answer in a sound bite. I alluded to my part of the G.I. Joe generation. There are people who would argue that those toy manufacturers were very intentional and perhaps some would say in cahoots with the government to inculcate the sense of, it's cool to be a soldier. I don't know why it seems like such a universal experience. And it, not to stereotype, but it might be, especially for our generation, kind of a guy thing. But I would not have ever described myself as bloodthirsty, although I completed some of the Army's, most challenging schools throughout my career, schools that were intended to prepare leaders for tough work. But I'll tell you, when I moved out here and made the change almost again accidentally from combat arms to civil affairs, I found that very gratifying in a sense, because my job was no longer to pull the trigger. It was to essentially minimize the impact of someone else having pulled that trigger, because that's what civil affairs does. We're not the peaceniks of the Army, or by any means, but our job is to minimize the effect of conflict on the civilian populace and try to restore stability. And it was kind of like, whew, I don't have to worry about being a badass anymore, being the biggest, toughest guy on the block. I can just go and work with the UN, work with Doctors Without Borders as a military person to try to fix things that combat has broken.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you for the question.
Any other questions? Did we miss anything?
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, Steve and Pete, thank you.